There's a valley in Canada where the bodies of men have been found with their heads cut completely off, and nobody has ever been charged with a single murder. There are stone circles in the Canadian wilderness so old they were already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were being built, and scientists still cannot agree on what they were built for. There's a site in the frozen Arctic where someone carved almost 180 human faces into solid rock, every single one different. And to this day, not one archaeologist on Earth can tell you why. And there is a stone slab in the Ontario forest that sat hidden under a fallen tree for decades before revealing a secret so bizarre it took researchers 7 full years before they felt confident enough to tell anyone what they had found. Canada is one of the most misunderstood countries on Earth when it comes to ancient history. Everyone knows about Egypt. Everyone knows about Machu Picchu. Everyone debates Stonehenge. But Canada? People think it is just forests and hockey and very polite people. They are completely wrong. Hidden across this vast country, buried under centuries of ice, overgrown by boreal forest, and locked inside some of the most restricted military land in North America, are structures and sites that are genuinely among the most mysterious places on the entire planet. And the scientists and archaeologists who have spent their careers studying these places will tell you plainly that some of the questions raised by these sites have no satisfying answers yet. We are going to go through 5 of them today. Every fact, every number, every detail that makes each one so hard to explain. And by the end of this, you're going to understand why Canada's ancient history is not a footnote to the story of human civilization. In many ways, it is one of the most fascinating chapters we have barely even begun to read. Let us start in southern Ontario, because the site there is something most people drive past without even knowing it exists. And what it represents is a story of a proud and sophisticated civilization that was effectively wiped off the map within a single generation. Near the town of Iona in Elgin County, Ontario, there's a low ring of grass-covered mounds surrounding a flat, open field. To most people driving past on the Iona Road, it looks like nothing at all, just some slightly elevated ground running in an oval shape around a couple of acres of grass. Trees have grown up through the earthworks. The mounds are worn down by centuries of weather. If it looks like anything, like a slightly unusual field, what it actually is one of the most significant pre-contact archaeological sites in all of Canada, and the only example of a double-palisaded fortified village surrounded by earthworks anywhere in southern Ontario. The Southwold Earthworks was designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 1923. It is a rare and well-preserved example of an Aboriginal fortified village completely surrounded by earthworks, built by the Attawandaron, also called the Neutral Iroquois, between about 1450 and 1550 AD. The village was once home to several hundred people who lived in longhouses, multi-unit dwellings that housed entire extended families. The outer earthworks surrounded a 2-acre oval-shaped village, and posts or tree trunks pointed on the bottom and standing 4 to 5 meters in height were driven into the ground. Earth was then scraped from both sides to support the structure, leaving the present trench. What you are looking at when you visit Southwold today is the ghost of an engineering project, the negative space left behind when the wooden walls rotted away and the earth settled. The Neutral Nation, who built this place, were building something that required serious planning and serious labor. This was not a collection of temporary shelters. This was a fortress. The Neutral people emerged as a distinct group within Iroquois culture about 1450. They were so called because they did not participate in wars between traditional Iroquois rivals. That neutrality ultimately aroused the ire of the Iroquois Confederacy, and Mohawk and Seneca raids brought about the demise of the Neutral Nation by 1650. Think about what that means. In the space of about 200 years, an entire civilization built a fortified city in Ontario, maintained it, raised generations of children inside its walls, and was then completely destroyed. The Neutral Nation does not exist today. Their language is gone, their customs, their ceremonies, their knowledge of why exactly they built the earthworks the way they did, all of it is gone. Southwold is the only known instance of double earthworks in all of Canada. There is nothing else like it. And only 2 major archaeological investigations have ever been conducted there, once in 1935 during the Great Depression, and once in 1976. A site that is unique in the entire country has received roughly the same level of scientific investigation as a moderately interesting parking lot. The questions that remain are enormous. Were the earthworks purely defensive? Some researchers think so. Others point out that no physical evidence of an attack has ever been found at the site, which raises the possibility that this mighty double-walled fortification was never actually tested in battle. Maybe it was a ceremonial center. Maybe the walls themselves were the message, a statement of power so obvious that enemies decided not to find out what was inside them. Nobody knows. And that should bother you, because this is a National Historic Site of Canada, officially recognized since 1923, And the honest answer to the most basic question about it, why did they build those specific walls in that specific way, is still genuinely unclear. Now we travel north, deep into the Ontario wilderness near the town of Wawa, and we arrive at one of the strangest detective stories in Canadian archaeological history. In 2018, a tree fell over in the northern Ontario forest. This happens constantly in the boreal. Trees fall, they rot, the forest moves on. But this particular tree had been growing on top of a slab of bedrock. When it came down, its root system lifted the rock slightly, and what was revealed underneath stopped the first person who saw it completely cold. The exposed bedrock was covered in carvings, 255 of them, arranged not haphazardly, not scattered randomly the way most rock art is, but in a perfectly organized square, laid out with a precision and deliberateness that looked nothing like any native pictograph style anyone in Ontario had ever documented. Right beside the square of symbols was an image of a boat with 16 figures on it. The boat did not look like a birch bark canoe. It looked like something with a high prow and a deep keel. It looked, to the untrained eye, remarkably like a Viking longship. The photographs made their way to archaeologist Ryan Primrose, director of the Ontario Centre for Archaeological Education. He had been in this field for years. He said looking at those photographs was one of the least expected discoveries of his career. He went to the site, he studied it, and then he did something unusual. He said nothing publicly for 7 years, not because he was hiding anything, but because he needed to understand exactly what he was looking at before he told the world, because he already suspected that whatever the truth turned out to be, it was going to collide with a lot of assumptions people carry about North American history. When Ryan finally opened up in 2025, the announcement was extraordinary. The symbols on the rock were Nordic runes. All 255 of them were part of a runic alphabet called Futhark, which was used in Scandinavia for centuries, and has survived in various forms to this day. There were Viking runes carved into a bedrock slab in the middle of the Ontario wilderness, and the immediate instinct of virtually everyone who heard that news was the same. The Vikings. They made it to Ontario. Ryan Primrose's answer to that theory was an immediate and emphatic no. To find out what the runes actually said, Ryan brought in Henrik Williams from Uppsala University in Sweden, one of the most respected specialists in runology, the academic study of runic inscriptions in the world. Henrik flew to Canada, trekked into the northern Ontario wilderness in October, crouched under a tarp with a flashlight in the cold, and spent hours studying the carvings with the kind of concentration that makes everyone around you feel slightly uncomfortable. And then the pattern started to emerge. The runes were words. The words were Swedish. The Swedish words formed sentences. And the sentences, when assembled completely, were the Lord's Prayer. Specifically, a 1611 runic version of the Lord's Prayer that was republished in Sweden in the 19th century. This was not a declaration of conquest. It was not a map to buried treasure. It was not evidence of a secret Viking voyage across the continent. It was a devout Swedish Christian who spent what Henrik estimated to be several weeks of dedicated work, chiseling the Lord's Prayer into a piece of Canadian bedrock in the middle of a boreal forest, probably sometime in the 1800s. Henrik admitted to being a little disappointed about the relatively recent age. He had been secretly hoping for something 1,000 years old. But the mystery of who carved it and why is still genuinely compelling. Ryan's subsequent investigation found that in the 1800s, the Hudson's Bay Company recruited Swedish workers to staff remote trading outposts in northern Ontario. The Michipicoten post was located not far from the rock. Ryan's working theory is that one of those Swedish workers far from home, isolated in the Canadian wilderness, missing his faith and his community, spent weeks creating a sacred inscription in the alphabet of his homeland. The boat, with 16 figures, possibly a memorial, possibly a prayer, possibly his way of imagining the people he had left behind across the ocean, an altar stone in the forest, hidden for a century and a half under the roots of a tree, discovered by an accident of gravity, and carrying inside it a story of longing and devotion that nobody alive today can fully reconstruct. Now let us go west to the flat plains of Alberta. Because what sits out there on a hilltop overlooking the Bow River is not just the oldest monument in Canada. It is one of the oldest constructed religious sites anywhere on Earth. The Majorville cairn in Medicine Wheel, known to the Blackfoot as Iniskim Umapi, is located south of Bassano, Alberta. The Medicine Wheel has been dated to 3200 BCE by careful stratification of known artifact types. That is over 5,000 years ago. To put that in context, Egypt's Great Pyramid was built around 2560 BCE. The Majorville Medicine Wheel predates the pyramids by more than 600 years. It predates Stonehenge. It predates the unification of Egypt. When the people who built Majorville were laying their stones on that Alberta hilltop, most of what we think of as ancient civilization had not yet begun. The Majorville Medicine Wheel consists of a central cairn 9 meters across, with 28 spokes, radiating outward to form an outer ring that is 27 meters in diameter. At around 5,000 years old, it is also the oldest known medicine wheel. Dating was first done by examining the style of spear points and arrowheads at the site, and later corroborated by precise radiocarbon dating of bone fragments found at the bottom of the cairn. Archaeologists excavated the southern half of the cairn in 1977 and discovered that the central cairn was constructed over 5,000 years in accretional domes. Analysis of the 17,000 plus artifacts recovered suggests the cultural practice originated from 3200 to 2500 BCE and continued to be used uniformly until around 1000 BCE. Use of the cairn declined until about 200 AD, when use picked up again until European contact. 17,000 artifacts, 5,000 years of continuous use. People were coming to this hilltop, adding to the cairn, making offerings, performing ceremonies, generation after generation after generation, from before Egypt was unified until European explorers arrived. That level of sustained religious significance is almost without parallel anywhere on Earth. But what was it actually for? This is where the disagreement gets genuinely fascinating. One popular but controversial theory is that medicine wheels are ancient observatories. The astronomer John Eddy proposed in the 1970s that medicine wheel geometries often reflect various celestial alignments. The Majorville, Bighorn, and Moose Mountain medicine wheels have all been found to support the astronomical alignment theory. The 28 spokes of the wheel correspond to the 28-day lunar cycle. Specific alignments of the stone lines point toward the rising positions of major stars on astronomically significant dates. The whole structure, placed on the highest hill with a clear view in all four directions, functions as a precision instrument for reading the sky. One astronomer who examined the hypothesis says that while there is some stone evidence of astronomical alignment, it cannot be proven as fact. After studying both the Majorville and Bighorn wheels, he concluded they are still completely mysterious and could have had many purposes, from vision quests and sun dances to ritual ceremony. The Blackfoot Nation, whose ancestors built and used this site, say the astronomical theory is missing the point entirely. For the Blackfoot, Iniskamoomapi is not a calendar or an observatory. It is a place of healing and spiritual balance. The four quadrants of the wheel represent four dimensions of human well-being: emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual. It is a place where people come to find balance, where they have come to find balance for 5,000 years. And here's the thing, both explanations might be true. A monument built over 5 millennia by dozens of successive cultures does not have to have one single purpose. It could have been a star calendar when the first stones were laid and a healing sanctuary by the time European settlers arrived, with every possible combination of uses in between. The honest answer is that we have 17,000 artifacts and 5,000 years of evidence, and we still cannot definitively say what the people who built this were building it for. Now we go to the very far north, to a place so remote that most Canadians have never heard of it and very few outsiders have ever seen it, to a small island in the Hudson Strait in the territory of Nunavut, where one of the most unusual collections of prehistoric art anywhere on Earth has been sitting in the Arctic wind for up to 1,500 years. Qajartalik, which means where there is a kayak in Inuktitut, is the largest and most well-studied petroglyph site in the Canadian Arctic. It is one of only 4 known sites in the Canadian Arctic and Greenland with petroglyphs. Based on the artistic style of the carved images, archaeologists believe the Dorset people made them during the latter third of their cultural period, meaning the petroglyphs are roughly 700 to 4,500 years old. Qajartalik features more than 180 carvings of human-like faces, some of which are endowed with animal attributes. These petroglyphs are found mainly on 2 large outcrops of soapstone. The images at this ancient place were carved by the Dorset people who inhabited the Arctic before the Thule Inuit. Think about what that means. 180 faces. Every single petroglyph a face. When you visit rock art sites in the American Southwest, or in Europe, or in Africa, you get variety. Animals, geometric patterns, stick figures, handprints, abstract symbols. The human visual imagination, when given a surface to mark, produces an enormous range of imagery. At Qajartalik, for reasons nobody has ever successfully explained, the Dorset artists carve faces, only faces, over and over and over again on every available surface of soapstone. The faces are always front-facing. They usually measure between 10 centimeters and 30 centimeters, although some are approximately 3 centimeters long, and a few reach 60 centimeters in size. Most are human faces, but some are animal faces, and others are faces with a mix of human and animal features. In some areas of the site, there's a single face on one rock formation, while others are crowded with a dozen faces together. The Dorset people who carved these faces were remarkable. The Dorset people lived along the coasts of Nunavik from 2,200 to 1,000 years ago and disappeared before the arrival of the Thule Inuit approximately 800 years ago. They survived in the high Arctic for over 1,000 years, in conditions that would kill most modern humans within days without specialized equipment and clothing. And they created art, sophisticated, deliberate, technically demanding art that required carving into hard soapstone with stone tools on a tiny island at the edge of the world. Qajartalik appears to be the only place where Dorset-era peoples transposed onto soapstone, on a huge scale, the distinctive figures usually found on much smaller artifacts made of bone, ivory, or horn. So the faces were a known artistic form for the Dorset. They carved similar faces on small objects all across the Arctic. But here, at Qajartalik, they scaled it up to a monumental level. They chose this specific island and this specific soapstone formation and carved 180 faces into it. The question that nobody can answer is why they chose this place, why only faces, and what the faces meant. Parks Canada describes the site as one where Dorset artists expressed themselves on a grand scale by carving faces into the rock mass to communicate their vision of the world, a vision that was very likely connected to the magico-religious universe of the Dorset people and the iconic representations of Paleo-Eskimo shamans. But that description, while thoughtful, is essentially saying we think it was religious and shamanic in nature, which is what archaeologists say about most unexplained prehistoric art. The specific meaning, the reason for 180 and not 10 or 500, the reason for the animal-human hybrid faces alongside the purely human ones, the reason this particular island was chosen remains genuinely unknown. Even the local Inuit communities who consider themselves the caretakers of the site do not have a tradition that fully explains it. The knowledge was lost when the Dorset disappeared. And finally, we go to the place that has terrified people for over a century, the place that has earned more grim nicknames than anywhere else in Canada, the valley in the Northwest Territories that people call Deadman Valley, Headless Creek, and the Funeral Range. A place where for decades people went in and did not come out, and the ones who were found came out without their heads. The Nahanni Valley sits roughly 300 miles from Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, sprawling across 11,600 square miles of wilderness that can only be reached by boat or floatplane. The nearest road ends 90 miles away in the abandoned village of Tungsten. In 2018, Nahanni National Park saw just 1,500 visitors, yet this UNESCO World Heritage Site has earned names that would give anyone pause before booking that floatplane. Valley of the Headless Men, Deadman Valley, Headless Creek, the Funeral Range. These aren't colorful nicknames dreamed up by tourism boards. They mark actual locations where bodies were discovered, where people vanished, where something went terribly wrong. The story begins in 1905. Willie and Frank McLeod ventured into the valley driven by the feverish rumor of a creek where gold nuggets the size of grapes lay scattered in the silt. They never came back. Years later, a search party found their remains. Their decomposed bodies were discovered without their heads, fueling rumors of a sinister force at work in the valley. In 1917, prospector Martin Jorgensen built a cabin in the Nahanni and wrote letters claiming he had struck gold. His cabin later burned down and his decapitated body was found among the ashes. Then, in 1945, an unidentified miner from Ontario was discovered in his sleeping bag, also headless. Others, including Yukon Fisher in 1927 and Phil Powers in 1931, turned up in similar fashion. By the mid-1900s, word got around that these decapitations followed a weird pattern. Burned cabins, headless remains, lost fortunes. Between 1906 and 1969, when the Nahanni River Valley was first explored by gold-seeking Europeans, 44 people were killed, or reported as missing. Out of those whose remains were found, 6 of the victims were missing their heads. Now here is where the story gets deeper than just the murders. Because the Dani people, the indigenous inhabitants of this region, had been warning outsiders about the Nahanni Valley for a very long time before the first European prospectors arrived. And their warning was specific. They spoke of a tribe called the Naha, warlike, aggressive, cave-dwelling people who came down from the high mountains only to kill. The Naha raided Dean villages repeatedly, and then, at some point in the distant past, they simply disappeared. They stopped raiding. Nobody ever saw them again. The oral histories of the Dean say the Naha simply vanished into the mountains. Not a single piece of physical evidence confirming the existence of the Naha has ever been found. No ruins, no graves, no tools. They exist only in Dene oral tradition. But the Dene are absolutely certain they were real, and the valley contains, by various accounts, over 250 unexplored caves in its limestone karst formations. Some have suggested the Nahanni Valley is one of the last truly unexplored places in the world. The valley is dotted with subterranean caverns, some 250 of them, and many remain unexplored. The rational explanations for the headless bodies are less exciting, but probably more accurate. In extreme wilderness, decapitation can occur naturally when animal predators scatter and consume remains over time. The harsh conditions of the Nahanni could do things to a human body that would look deliberate, but were the work of nature. The burned cabins, combined with accidental fires from improvised heating and remote shelters, are not unusual in the early 20th century wilderness, and the Gold Rush era produced enormous amounts of violence between competing prospectors that was never properly investigated by authorities who were hundreds of miles away. But none of that fully explains every case. None of it accounts for the consistency of the pattern, and none of it tells you with certainty that there is nothing left in those 250 unexplored caves. That is the honest truth about Canada's ancient mysteries. Some of them have been solved, like the Ontario runestone that turned out to be the prayer of a lonely Swedish worker far from home. Some of them are partially understood, like the Majorville medicine wheel, where we know the age and the construction, but not the full meaning. Some of them remain almost completely unexplained, like the 180 faces at Qajartalik staring out of the Arctic soapstone at anyone brave enough to reach them. And some of them, like the Nahanni Valley, sit right at the edge of what we can explain and what we simply cannot. Canada's ancient history is not less interesting than Egypt's or Peru's or Greece's. In many ways, it is more interesting because so much of it is still buried, still overgrown, still hidden under fallen trees and Arctic ice and restricted military land. The full story of what happened in this country before Europeans arrived is one of the great unfinished chapters in the history of our species. And we are only now, slowly, beginning to read it.